Hello there. Welcome to another episode of the ToddCast. So my guest today is Ian Bremmer. He is principal of the Eurasia Group, really sort of one of the foreign policy and national security analysts that I consume the most. If you've followed me down and Meet the Press and the NBC days, you know that I've used Ian quite a lot in my expert category when it comes to national security. He is as wired as there is when it comes to, particularly when it comes to America's closest economic allies, Japan, Canada, the UK, basically the G7, right? In many ways, the G7 is America's closest allies, the key European countries plus Japan and Canada there. And it's not just there that he's well-sourced. He's well-sourced in a lot of key trade allies. And given what's going on right now, and basically the conversation that I have with him is trying to see, is there to quote George H.W. Bush right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, at the time it was creating a new world order. And that was an exciting time to create a new world order. We were creating a new world order because the Iron Curtain fell. Well, are we now creating a new world order? A different one. Basically, the strongest shall thrive, right? And in many ways, this is, if you examine Donald Trump and what he really thinks when it comes to foreign policy, this really does, you're better off thinking this way than trying to come up with some other reasons why he thinks. He's a very binary thinker in this. There are winners and losers. There's no such thing in Donald Trump's world as win-win. He may say the phrase win-win. He may want people to believe that when he does a deal that he believes he's gotten the better end of the deal, that he'll call it win-win. But he doesn't actually think there's ever an even split. He doesn't really, truly believe there is such thing as a win-win. And so when you think of it that way, this is why he almost views every country that's not China and Russia as essentially a secondary power, and that they're somehow having to graft on. They're either a secondary power in Russia's sphere of influence, a secondary power in China's sphere of influence, or you're a secondary power in America's sphere of influence. And so when you think about it in those terms, it's possible at least to understand perhaps why he has behaved the way he's behaved with Ukraine, for instance. You sit here and you ask yourself, boy, Ukraine has done everything the president's asked. Russia has not, and yet we have no ceasefire, and yet the president is not lecturing Putin for not coming to the table, but he didn't mind lecturing Zelensky when Zelensky was already at the table. And I know there's plenty of other nefarious reasons that some people might apply to this idea of why Trump is being more patient with Putin than anything else. But I can tell you this, at some point, Donald Trump is going to see that Putin is disrespecting him, that Putin is using him, that Putin thinks he's got control of Trump. And one of the things that's been a hallmark of Trump over the years is anybody who thinks they have some sort of hold or over Trump, he likes to then prove that wrong. And I can tell you this, I know there's a lot of people around Donald Trump who don't love how he's managed this negotiation with Ukraine and Russia, and are hoping that he starts to realize what many people around him do realize, which is Putin is not to be trusted. And he's never really going to be somebody you can trust. Will, at some point, Donald Trump realize that Putin is disrespecting him? I think that's an open question. What about Xi? Right? He sees himself as sort of, there's this odd respect he gives to Xi. Right? He loves to talk about what a great relationship he has with Xi. Ironically, it was Joe Biden that actually had the long-term relationship when he was vice president. She was essentially vice premier, and they got to know each other walking around the heartland at Iowa and things like that. But because Donald Trump likes to create one-on-one relationships, I think he believes, especially if somebody that he believes has equal amount of power or equal amount of wealth, right? In this case, he sort of sees Putin and Xi more as equals than he does the prime minister of Japan or the prime minister of the UK or the president of France. And so Is this a new world order, or is this just a moment that we're in because Donald Trump is president and this is how he thinks? Do we really expect this to become the through line of Republican politics post-Trump? It's hard to imagine that it will, considering it does appear that there are fewer Republicans truly on board with this line of thinking. But we'll see. As for what the tariffs have done to sort of America's alliances, this is a long part of our conversation with Ian. And I think it's fascinating. He is not as pessimistic as some folks are, but he's also not Pollyannish about what Trump is trying to do either. I will say this, and I think that it's something that Ian and I get into, but I can't emphasize this enough. And I've said this a few times when it comes to why is Trump 2.0 so different from Trump 1.0? And the biggest sort of, it really starts at the beginning. There are three people that were around him who put together the presidential staff and cabinet the first time: Mike Pence, Reince Priebus, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. None of those three people are there this time. This time, the administration was put together by folks who weren't thinking about the party at large, but were thinking about Donald Trump first. And I do think the biggest mistake many of us have made, including the stock market, was assuming that Trump 1.0 would have influence over Trump 2.0, that what Trump 1.0 did on the issue of tariffs, for instance, will be similar to what he would do in Trump 2.0. And I think that the lesson that we ought to take away now as we near the 100-day mark is simply this: Trump 2.0 is its own unique presidency. In some ways, if you are trying to figure out what he's going to do next, the least helpful way to figure that out is to look through the prism of Trump 1.0, because that is not the case. I do think you have a guy who does behave as if he isn't running again, despite some of the rhetoric and some of the pearl clutching that's out there when it comes to him seeking a third term and not abiding by the Constitution and things like that. If you actually think about some of the moves he's made, they actually make no sense politically in the short term for him or the Republican Party. But if he truly believes in creating this economic legacy and quote unquote, making America great again by returning manufacturing to the United States and somehow hoping to turn back the clock on the entire globe, I question whether that's even possible. That he's more in a Thelma and Louise mode. He's driving off the cliff, regardless of the short-term political consequences. So we'll see. I think that it is every time the markets think they have found a guardrail on tariffs, he seems to want to go the other way. So I do think we're still going to remain in this uncertain world. And as long as there's uncertainty, all that's going to do is slow down the economy. And all that's going to do is cause short-term problems politically. But with that, a little bit of a tour of the world, starting with how has this approach to tariffs reordered America's alliances around the globe? What does it mean going forward? And here's something to think about. What's the likelihood that we have a trilateral summit before the end of this calendar year between Putin, Xi, and Trump? And how would the world and how would America react to something like that? Just something to think about. So with that, I'm going to sneak in a quick break. And when we come back, my conversation with Ian Bremmer. All right, and joining me now is Ian Bremmer. He is the principal behind the Eurasia Group. He is somebody that if you've been following my work, you know that I count on Ian as one of the great sort of global experts, both in sort of the national security space and the international business space. His ear to the ground, particularly with G7 and G20 nations, is as good as anybody's. He's pretty sourced up in some of the key Western powers around the world that matter a lot more and more these days with our politics. Let me timestamp this. It is Monday afternoon, April 14th, because as we know in the Trump era, you just never know. But Ian, it's good to talk with you. It's good to have you in here.
Absolutely. Happy to join the new podcast.
I appreciate that. new relaunched. It's, everything old is new again, right? But let's look. I think there's no doubt that Donald Trump has done what he wanted to do, which is shake up the world economic order. And I guess the question is, he's have we broken the economic order yet, or has he just done significant damage to it? Um, that based on how things go over the next couple of years, it's repairable.
Um, I think that there are some things that are going to change permanently
Hmm.
on the back of all of this. So no, I don't think you can put Humpty Dumpty together again. That doesn't mean that he's broken the global economy. But what I mean by that is you have all sorts of countries around the world now that want to find ways long term to de-risk their exposure with our own United States. I mean, over the last 10 years, everyone's been talking about de-risking away from China, right? Because
Right.
they were
Or,
opaque and didn't have rule
sure.
of law, they were capricious, they promoted their own national champions. And it was just, and also because US China relations weren't that good. So, how much exposure did you really want long term with
Hmm.
China? And that has led to a shift in global supply chain, in capital flows. It helped India really take off, hurt China's economy.
Hmm.
That's You're now going to see a process of de-risking away from the United States. It is harder to do because the U.S.
Hmm.
is, of course, a larger economy, and for some countries, the U.S. is utterly critical for things like advanced technology and for national
Hmm.
security support. And of course, the US dollar is still the global reserve currency. But I mean, those decisions that are
Right.
being made are long term changes of trajectory that are not going to shift back.
And why is that? I'm going to guess why that is, but I want you to, I mean, is it because this country's elected someone like Donald Trump twice? So why shouldn't we assume the country won't go back and forth between maybe you have an internationalist and a protectionist and an that this is the new normal in America, and in order to have trust in America, it's probably going to take decades of consistency to convince some of these countries to trust us again.
I don't think it's that, Chuck.
Okay.
I think that if Trump second term was a repetition of Trump first term, I
Hmm.
wouldn't be saying that. He
Right.
was, in other words, if Trump was much more constrained by his own cabinet, by his own Republican Party.
By the way, and I continue to make this point. I mean, Mike Pence and Reince Priebus were the guardrail. They built all the guardrails
Sure.
around Trump, and we look back, and there was. I don't think people realized how significant and important it was that the two of them were in charge of personnel, both on national security and economic policy, because
Absolutely,
it's
absolutely, Chuck. And you knew that
completely
better than
different this time.
most.
Yeah,
You knew that better than
completely
most.
different
But
than it.
but since we're talking about trade right now, I mean, also Robert Lighthizer,
Yeah,
also Steve Mnuchin, also Jared Kushner. I mean, it was just
not
a
there, not
different,
there, not
not
there.
there,
Yeah.
not there. So I think what we're seeing now is a response to the United States suddenly pushing tariffs up to 1930s level and beyond. I think
Mhm.
it is the president declaring that he individually has the ability for national security emergency purposes through IEPA to actually change unilaterally trade agreements that countries around the world thought were the Americans were legally committed to. I mean, the US Mexico Canada agreement, which Trump himself did, Trump is now essentially unwinding for from his own authority. And I mean, there's going to be lawsuits and that's going to work its way through the
Right.
courts. But if you're a country that is trying to work in a global supply chain, your ability to rely on, to count on the United States
Mhm.
is nowhere close to what it was 3 months ago. And that's before you get into all
Right.
the other stuff, the claims on Greenland and Panama, the willingness to export algorithms that undermine democracy, the threats to rule of law domestically in the US,
Right.
going after universities and scientific grants, and all of those things that make the US less attractive. Just looking at the trade story, This is nothing close to what we had under Biden or under
Right.
Trump 1. And that is what the countries are responding to.
So if your goal is to de-risk from the United States,
Yeah.
a lot of times it meant, de-risking from China meant, frankly, getting closer to the United States, getting closer to India, getting closer to perhaps the EU. What is de-risking if you're pulling away from the United States? Is this now everybody's just simply retreating and you'll do a little bit of business with China, a little bit of business with the United States, just where it financially makes sense? Is that what you're describing? Or does China have an opportunity here to become sort of the transactional leader of the global economy, meaning, you know what, we're not going to judge you politically. We're just here to do business.
So, in the global south, with the exception of India, which is important, and we can get to that in a bit,
Hmm.
all of those countries already had China as their leading trade partner.
Right.
So, I mean, the United States having just blown up USAID, and now saying they're putting tariffs, another 10% on all these countries, no matter how poor they are, whether or not they have people. Clearly, that makes China mop up in those countries, right? Sure,
Right.
I buy that, but that was the trajectory before Trump put the tariffs on anyway. So,
Hmm.
not a massive change there. For the Europeans, for example, you're now going to see, and for Latin America, you're seeing those countries, regions work more quickly to ensure that they get the EU Mercosur trade deal in place immediately. For
Hmm.
India, moving more closely, fast tracking trade engagement with the EU and with the UK and with Australia and with New Zealand and a bunch of other countries around the world. For Canada, it is how can we work more closely with the Europeans as fast as possible and coordinate more with them. For the Chinese, first and foremost, it's Southeast Asia. You see, Xi Jinping just went to
Yep.
Vietnam, 45 new trade agreements.
Spending all week in Southeast Asia, sort of
All
making
week in
nice.
Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
That wasn't the plan. That wasn't
Right.
the plan 3 months ago. It is now, right? So you've got that. Now, I that story is not the U.S. is sort of going to lose influence and all of it goes to China. That is everyone trying to hedge everywhere at the margins and more over time so that they can't be hit as badly by a capricious
Hmm.
overnight decision that can change again tomorrow by President Trump and his top advisors. On the other hand, Chuck, there is a longer term concern that as the United States pulls away from its own globalization order with American standards and values and institutions, the second largest economy in the world will become dominant in much of that architecture. So the US leaves the World Health Organization, China becomes dominant. The US pulls out of the Paris Climate Accord. Who's got all of the transition energy at scale, solar power,
Hmm.
batteries, supply chain, critical minerals? China. So, going forward at the COP summits every year to advance how we're going to respond to climate change and a post carbon energy environment, China becomes the dominant actor. The United States is not. So, I do think that and if the US were to pull out of the United Nations and decide
Hmm.
not to pay, then the Chinese would become the
Right.
dominant country influencing the UN too. So, longer term, I think there are real opportunities structurally for China that
Right.
other countries don't have. Near term, it's just like cut deals as fast as possible
Right.
with the Americans can they get because they can hurt you. And I think that, the Secretary of Treasury, Bessent, when he says all these countries are calling me to cut deals, he's not lying about that. That's true. Because, I mean, the US can do a lot of damage if you don't get those deals done. But that de risking is causing a hedging behavior
Right.
of every country and company around the world. Reduce your exposures to the US as you can.
Seems to be another big winner out of this, and I don't think this is what Donald Trump intended. You said the EU quite a bit. Seems to be a real opportunity for the EU, perhaps, to sort of flex its muscles and maybe finally sort of get itself on a not an equal playing field, but on a stronger playing field a little bit if they're able to be the Western, I guess, way station, if you will, for Asia and Latin America?
That would be the good outcome. That would
Hmm.
be the stabilizing outcome if, on the back of all of this US driven geopolitical uncertainty and volatility and
Right.
shock, if
Let's
the
underline that
Europeans,
U.S. driven
US
global.
driven,
I mean,
US
that is
driven,
what this is what's just so mind-boggling, I think, to so many people in the United States, business leaders, political leaders, you name it, which is like this has all been self-inflicted. This is everybody is behaving as if a war just happened or a pandemic just happened, but instead Trump just happened.
that's
That's
right.
what happened.
A decision. I mean, Trump is symptomatic of an awful lot of
Of
Americans that
course.
increasingly don't support US driven collective security, US driven rule of
Right.
law, US driven free trade. So it's not like this is new. This has been coming for decades,
Of
but
course.
Trump's second term absolutely said, I am going to destroy this old order. Everyone is taking advantage of us. That's not going to
Right.
happen anymore. So, I mean, this is what people voted for. He said he was going to do it, and now
Right.
he's doing it. All
Not
right.
sure people, this is I can tell you, I mean, this is what I think the great misunderstanding of this election, which is he may have said it, but he said it going into the first election. He didn't do it. There were a lot of people that just assumed, hey, am I going to get Trump 1.0? I'll take that over
Yep.
Biden and Harris
Yep.
2.0,
It's fair.
which that's what people, I think, at least the ones that decided this election, right?
And
And
by the way, I think
ultimately,
the markets agreed with you, Chuck.
that's
The
right. The
markets were
markets didn't believe
so
this.
surprised because they thought, he's saying it, but he doesn't mean it.
He doesn't really mean it
Doesn't
because
really mean it.
ultimately he doesn't want to. I think, as somebody put it, maybe you did it in your newsletter today, he doesn't want to look like a fool for destroying America's economic leadership, right? That bothers him that people with more money than him will think he's an idiot, right? So that weirdly can serve as a guardrail with him. But I don't know.
I don't know. But
He
let's go back
seems
to Europe because you
increasingly
asked me the
isolated.
Europe
But I want to
question.
go back to you
Chuck,
because
yeah.
it does feel as if they're potentially a beneficiary here if, frankly, they know how to take advantage of this moment. And
Well,
they don't
so
always
the
do.
the the good news is that this, and it's not good news for the United States near term,
Hmm.
is that the Europeans do understand that this requires more unity. So they have to, if they don't have Hungary with them, they have to take decisions not on the basis of 27 country unanimity, but redefine what consensus means.
Hmm.
They need to play harder ball. They need to spend more. They need to get rid of the debt brake in Germany. The UK needs to align with what the Europeans are up to. The Italians have to prioritize the EU more than their bridge with the US. All of those things are true. All of those things are happening. But long term, do I believe that the Europeans have what it takes to survive in an environment where they're going to get hit a lot harder, right? I mean, the US economy is much, much stronger than Europe. And, today, you look at the average EU citizen, you realize this place is poorer than Mississippi, poorer than the
I know.
poorest
You've been making
American
this point
state.
in how, frankly, our standard of living. I mean, this is the frustrating thing about people not understanding how good we have it
How
here.
good we have it.
How better our standard of living is in Mississippi compared to every other member of the G7.
So the
Okay.
idea that the Europeans, with that level of comparative
Hmm.
poverty and anger internally,
Right.
are suddenly going to, 50% more spending on defense with countries, many countries that have no fiscal space, that are very highly indebted in an inflation and interest rate environment that's going to be going up. And they've got all the illegal migrants that are trying to get in. They've got the Russians, sort of right next to them that the Americans are trying to cut a deal with over their heads. I'm not sure Europe makes it in this model. Europe does have a more functional political system, a less kleptocratic political system, a more transparent political system
Right.
than the United States, just as Canada, just as Japan.
Uh,
That's true. But unfortunately, the future of the global order does
mhm.
not seem to be more power to the countries that have the best rule of law. The future seems to be that the power is in the hands of the top down. We can determine outcomes on the basis not of rule of law, but on the basis of the people that have power can tell you what to do. And the Chinese are doing that with the state controlling the economy, and the US is doing that with the private sector and special interests controlling the state. So is it a state capitalist model or is it a
Mm,
kleptocratic model? Either way, I think the Europeans are getting squeezed. So long term, I'm not sure this
mm.
opportunity in Europe is going to be seized by the Europeans.
Let's go back to China.
Yeah,
Um, how much has Donald Trump's moves sort of helped to bail Xi out a little bit, right? He's got his own domestic economic issues. The fact of the matter is, I would argue, decoupling over the last 3 or 4 years, frankly, what was started under Trump and continued under Biden,
it did.
was
Yeah,
having the desired effect on China, right? We were the pivot to India, and in typical Trump fashion, I guess you could look at it as impatience. If the long term goal was to essentially weaken China, um, this was happening, just not at a huge speed, a little bit, but it was potentially happening. But this seems to, if anything, provide Xi a lifeline to perhaps get better relations with some of the Asian countries that would have preferred U.S. protection, both on security, but also having an economic partnership. And now it's, well, geez, there's China's over here in our region. Not crazy about them as a partner, but I don't know what to make of the United States these days. I guess I got to take this meeting with China. The point is, it just feels like we handed China a huge opportunity when actually they were, I don't want to say in retreat. They were on their heels a little bit.
that's a tough one. It's a tough one, Chuck. I'm literally torn on this
Hmm.
topic because, U.S. policy towards China has been a bipartisan consensus over the last decade. The Chinese were convinced that everyone in the U.S. was trying to contain them no matter what. Under Trump
By the
first
way, I think they're
term,
right about that.
yeah,
I do think
under
that that was
under
probably the view of 90 out of 100 senators.
Yeah. So under Trump, I mean, that's when you started some of these tariffs. Under Trump,
Hmm.
that's when you started hitting the Chinese on Huawei and 5G. Then
Right.
under Biden, you extend the tariffs, you do more export controls, you hit them on semiconductors, for example. Now, the reaction of that by the Chinese was, okay, we can't rely on TSMC in Taiwan. We need to invest everything
Right.
into these new high technologies internally. And, you look at how shocked our friends in Silicon Valley and elsewhere were by the release of DeepSeek, right? That was, Chinese investment into Chinese domestic capacity. Yes, with Western semiconductors, but they're moving as fast as possible to not have that
Well,
reliance. Did we,
this was so
is that
naive.
good or bad?
I know, this was so naive on our part, right? What is the mother of invention, right? Necessity
Necessity.
sometimes.
Right.
Yes. I mean, what did you think? They have 1 billion people. You don't think they can find some that have just as uh, smart of brains as our guys do on this? I mean, it really was, frankly, one of those um, ridiculous American exceptionalism
Look, I
moments.
remember, Chuck, at the beginning of the Trump administration, I had a big debate with Steve Bannon, who,
Hmm.
as you know, is no intellectual slouch.
Hmm.
And he was making this argument that we have to fight the Chinese now. We have to hit them as hard as possible because we're at a moment that otherwise they're going to become dominant in all these technologies globally. And if we don't do it now, we're never going to be able to. And my response to him was, in order to make that work, even if you agree, even if I agree with you that the relationship has to be zero sum and there's no way to engage with
Hmm.
the Chinese long term, you still have to be able to execute on that plan. And that means not just for one term, but over a series of
Right.
political terms, and not just the United States by itself, but combined with allies. And I go back to that conversation in my mind a lot nowadays, thinking about the Americans just don't have the political system to execute. The reason why rule of law works better for the United States than it does for China is because the US is not a multi-generational dictatorship with a single political party.
Right. Right.
And so actually we benefit from having some public goods that we constrain a whole bunch of countries around the world to align with, including ourselves. We limit our own power to a degree because we know we can't actually do just hitting countries
Right.
strategically and consistently in the face in the same way over 10, 20, 30 years. Even if, you thought that was the best way to run the world, and I
Right.
don't, and you know that. But even if you believed it's all law of the jungle, the fact is the US doesn't have the best political system to operate with the law of the jungle. And that is something
Well,
that the Trump team just
right.
disagrees with.
Well, the thing that I've always sort of disagreed also with the Trump team on this is this idea that they're convinced the Chinese model is going to work. Right? Look, I believe that the Chinese have built a middle class that are going to start demanding things. And this is, we saw it in our own country. And I look at the beginnings of the 20th century and we're using child labor, we're doing all sorts of
Yeah,
frankly terrible abusive things, right? And what happened? The middle class said, we need these rights. We need these rights. We need these rights. Well, we were a democracy, so there were lots of avenues to do this. I've always thought the weight of that was the best check we had on China, a check that their own people were eventually going to put on them. And this is where it frustrates me to essentially accelerate this because now you're essentially giving Xi an opportunity to blame America for their current economic woes,
true.
which is some truth to that now
Yeah,
too, right? It's going to
yeah.
accelerate it, and buy himself more time with a middle class that there are lots of little pieces of evidence that this is becoming an issue for them, whether it's the housing issue that they were dealing with or what we saw during COVID, and so it really is I think an overestimation of the strength of the CCP.
Yeah, I was with you on that argument strongly
Hmm.
15,
Until
20
when?
years ago.
Yeah.
And,
Look.
I remember all the op-eds that Tom Friedman used to write about how the middle class was becoming restive and look at the
Mhm.
demonstrations in China and, look at the Uyghurs. And of course, I mean, what the Chinese were able to do in Xinjiang is create a technology empowered surveillance society
Mhm.
over well over 1 million people. And they can't do a damn thing, and the
Yeah.
Chinese government has complete control and they can nudge them into patriotic behavior or else. And what I fear, I mean, yes, the Chinese government has provided extraordinary economic growth for decades now, and they get
Mhm.
credit for that, even though it's not performing as well right now. But they also are the most technologically empowered authoritarian state in the
Right.
world at scale. And I worry that in
Mm.
marked contrast to the communications revolution, where everybody had access to an internet that gave them more information on what was happening in their own country and around the world and
Mm.
made them want liberty, you now actually have a surveillance revolution, a data revolution, which is much more top down than bottom up,
Mhm.
where the Chinese government, actually has the ability to control behavior,
Mm.
or else. And it seemed, I mean, when you look at what happened in the pandemic, and China's zero COVID policies were horribly repressive, draconian, and didn't work.
Absolutely.
And yet, when individual Chinese engaged in small scale demonstrations and did what
Right.
they could to try to, sort of obscure their identity, the Chinese police found them and their
Right.
relations and made knocks on those doors and said, okay, we're going to be
Mm.
soft with you. You got a one strike policy, but you do this again and you're
Mhm.
losing your job. You're losing your education. You may not be heard from again. And that had such a chilling effect. So I want you to be
Mm.
right on this one, Chuck. I
Yeah.
really do. But
But you're not.
I
Yeah.
worry that what's happening with technology in China, in the government, and in the West, in the private sector, is increasingly promoting illiberal,
Mhm.
closed political systems and
Yeah.
making them more powerful and stable.
What would life be like right now if there was a TPP?
A
This is for
Trump.
those that don't remember the
Oh, the
Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade
Trans-Pacific
Agreement.
Partnership, you mean?
This
Yeah,
was a trade
yeah.
agreement that basically all of the sort of leadership of both parties was basically in favor of circa 2014. Then the rise of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, um, who effectively messaged against it in a way to turn it into NAFTA and sort of used it to weaponize that that side of the argument, and it killed it in both parties. I'd
Yeah.
argue,
Yeah. Obama couldn't
uh,
get it done. Yeah.
right? And Hillary Clinton pulled
Trump
back
killed
from her
it.
support of it. Trump
That's
ends
right.
up killing it, and it makes me laugh because I think it was last week where Howard Lucknick was talking about bringing in all of our allies
With
in
the
Asia
allies,
together. And you're like,
we had
hey, I
that.
got an idea, dude.
Yeah.
We had this thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, had pretty much every Asian economy with a democracy involved. That's a good idea. I guess you think it is now, Mr. Lutnick, right?
And of course, it does exist, just not with the U.S. It's called the CPTPP.
This is
And
China's version of it, right? Yeah.
no, no, this was
Oh,
Shinzo Abe.
oh, the Jap.
When the Americans pulled out of the TPP, he
Yep.
said, you know what, we need to do this just without the United States. So not as powerful, but same basic deal, high standards, high level of integration.
Mm-hmm.
They all signed it. So it exists without the United States. But if the TPP had been done, had been signed, and you would have
Yep.
had some more growth and more trade
Mm-hmm.
integration, and then Trump gets elected again, because I don't think that
Yeah.
the existence of that would have stopped him from getting elected. I don't believe
Sure.
that.
No, no, no. Fair.
Then when he decided to do Liberation Day, it would have had the same level of restraint on him that the USMCA did between the US,
Right.
Mexico, and Canada, which is absolutely zero. So, I mean,
Yeah,
again, if the
fair.
president decides on the back of the American voters that free trade is actually something that other
Right.
countries use to take advantage of the US, and that every country needs to have historic levels of tariffs, even if the Americans are running a surplus. And that's the thing that really cheeses me off, right? It's the idea that Trump is saying that countries around the world, the US is running trade deficits, and therefore we need to put tariffs in place that will put that trade
Mm-hmm.
balance at parity. And you say, okay, I understand it's not reciprocal. You want to create reciprocity, but not only did he not actually, look at
Right.
the trade levels that way, but even with all the countries that the U.S. is running a surplus. In other words, by Trump's own logic, the U.S. must be taking advantage of those countries. Brazil,
Right.
Australia. He puts 10% tariffs, a very historically high level,
Right.
on those countries too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's literally no justification for it aside from the fact that he thinks he can because the Americans are powerful.
Look, you're work for a consulting group that tries to help business, I think, navigate the global political space. Is that a fair way of describing
I
your
mean,
business?
we do other things, but sure, that's one of the
Yeah,
things we do.
among
Sure.
among the things.
Yeah.
So you're asking a multinational corporation is asking you, okay, Trump says the goal is to return manufacturing into the United States, but he also apparently is open to negotiation.
Right.
So maybe that isn't the case. Um, how should we respond to this? Because at the end of the day, we're still going to do business on three major continents: North America, Europe, and Asia. We still want to do business on all three of those continents. So we can't, this isn't the 1930s, right? In the 1920s and 1930s, American businesses did business mostly in America. And so, that tariff regime also turned out to be a disaster, but we didn't even have a tenth of the global trade that we have today. So, what do you tell them? Where do you tell them to make their product? Where do you tell them to? Is it more of a, don't make any major decisions for the next 2 years. Let's wait till this shakes out, which of course is just a disaster for the global economy if that's the case.
In the short term, it is don't move supply chain other than U.S. China, where you now have, with the exception of this near-term carve-out for electronics,
Mm-hmm.
everything else is a trade embargo level. So those goods
Right.
aren't moving. I mean, when you've got 145%, you're not selling those goods, right?
No.
So
Right.
that is two largest economies in the world have to find other ways to get those goods, either transshipment through other
Yeah.
countries or source them someplace else.
I'm
That is an immediate move that you have to make right now.
I'm by
Everything
the way, I'm
else,
fascinated to go to a dollar store in about 2 months and see what inventory they have.
Yeah, it's
getting
going to be
ready for
really
that.
tough. I mean, heck, go
Yeah.
on Amazon right now and look at all of the things that are not available. It's
Mm,
kind of shocking. I
mm,
mean, you can literally anyone watching this right now should be doing that as an experiment, and you will see that it turns out that disrupting supply chain really really matters.
yeah.
So that, but outside of that, a 10% hit is not going to make people reshore to the United States.
Right.
The U.S. is too expensive for that.
Mhm.
So reshoring on the basis of what Trump has already announced
Mhm.
and then pulled back on is not happening. That's clearly not the proximate goal. And that means that you as a company are going to be paying those 10% tariffs and as best you can passing them on to your customers, which is either consumers or it's other businesses. And that's
Mhm.
what's happening. That's where we are. And of course, everyone is also lobbying, trying to
Mhm.
become an exception and an
Right.
exemption for Trump, like Apple just did, like Nvidia just did. I mean, those were very well spent dollars for those corporations, right?
Well, that's where you use the word kleptocratic,
Yes,
sort of. I've been saying we're moving towards a kleptocracy because,
correct.
I've always said that why Trump really likes tariffs is the control it puts him in, right? He's basically the deal maker for every industry and the deal
Yep,
maker for every country.
yep.
That is not the intent of the founders, and this is I'm not going to we're not going to go down this road, but Congress, is, we're if the American economy is destroyed, it's Congress's fault, right? They gave too much authority to the executive branch. But if that's indeed the case, then I mean, what's a good outcome for the United States if we're not reshoring?
Um, a good outcome for the United States is one where people believe in the American market long term. I mean, the U.S.
And they're willing
is
to put up with just whatever hurdles Donald Trump puts in front of them.
Well, again, unfortunately, given what we've seen over the last few weeks, and there's no reason to believe that that's going to stop in the next couple of years,
Hmm.
the damage is going to be massive. But it is massive damage in the context of Europe that is massively overregulated, and now they're saying they want to cut back on red tape and regulation. But how long is that going to take, and how much can they do from a
Hmm.
much poorer base? And no growth and no entrepreneurship and no unicorns, virtually no unicorns in the continent. And China, which continues to be state controlled and is much poorer even than Europe, and yes, has a large market, but also has no rule of law, has no independent judiciary, has no
Hmm.
ability to redress. If you annoy someone in government, you might as well pack up, right? You're in serious
Hmm.
trouble. So, I mean, it's not like there are great options and alternatives to the US, which does give the Americans the ability to screw up more. And yet, it can't be screwing up on every front simultaneously. So if Trump was just going to put in 10% tariffs on everybody and say, you guys have to pay it because I'm more powerful, he could have gotten away with that very easily. That would have been a big
And
win.
done nothing else, right? And then
Yeah.
use that money. Wants to use that money to offset, his tax cut and some other
Tax
things
cuts, for
there.
example, could have
Right. He
done
could have
that.
used it as budgetary help. Yeah.
Or even could have done that and not offset tax. Could have said,
Right.
I'm not doing the tax cuts. Instead, I'm going to, sort of provide support for the farmers
Right.
who are
Right.
otherwise going to take it on the
Use this
chin
tariff
because,
money and I'm going to give a refund to you, the American worker,
yeah,
whatever it
yeah.
is. Yeah.
But of course, when you're doing that and also fighting on 100 different fronts simultaneously,
Right.
and you're undermining American credibility, even with that massive lead that we have, especially post-pandemic, the
Mm.
fact is that you're going to cause massive long-term structural damage to the position of the United States. And that's so when you asked me right at the beginning, like, is permanent damage being done? Yeah, not that much short-term damage being done, but
Mm.
there's so much permanent long-term damage being
Mm.
done, which, I mean, Trump's 78, he cares about himself. He's not particularly strategic. He doesn't have, sort of he
Right.
doesn't spend, his attention span is limited. But, for those of us that are going to be here for longer than that, it's a real pain in the ass.
The rise of anti-American sentiment. I was at a meeting last week with some C-suite folks who were getting a briefing on this, some early survey work, that there's clear rise in this, and these companies who do business overseas but are known as basically American, associated as an American brand, are suddenly having to navigate this. What are you telling folks about this issue? And do you just expect it to get worse all over the world?
Again, not the first time this has been a
Right.
problem for Americans and American companies, but it is unprecedented, the level of anti-Americanism we're seeing even among our closest friends, the Canadians, where this is
That's been
driving
startling. I
elections.
know.
It's
When you're
crazy.
when
And,
the
and
nicest
not in
people on
Trump's
earth
interest at
are
all,
right, the
right?
nicest people on earth are booing the national anthem. You're like, I always have that. I had a colleague of mine who always saw the sunny side of things, and I'm like, when he sees something negative, it means you've got a problem. If the Canadians are booing you, it's
Yeah.
time for self-reflection.
It's time for self-reflection. It is. It's
Yeah.
really stupid. Ben Shapiro came out very strongly and said, look, Trump, this is an own goal. You need to patch things up with the
Hmm.
Canadians. He refused to do it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a big mistake, but it's also a big mistake to be going after students that are, certainly no more radicalized than, 80% of the campuses were
Ian,
in the
I've
60s.
always thought the First Amendment applied to anybody in this country at
Right.
any given moment. You didn't have to be a citizen to have freedom of speech. That is this idea that only citizens get the First Amendment protection of the First Amendment. That would not be a small d democracy.
Well, I
Sorry.
mean, these are the smartest kids from all over the world that have worked
Mhm.
their asses off with support from their families who are paying full tuition to
Yep.
get to the United States, to spend time here and to learn something, not just from the top universities, but also about the American system. And we are poisoning them for a generation.
A
We
generation.
are freezing the interest of others to come here where we should want them as
Small
opposed to
business
other
owner in
places.
Cambodia, small business owner in Nigeria, where maybe they're just starting to export stuff to the United States, and we've just bankrupted them.
Yeah. Yeah. So why would we want to do that? Why do we want to freeze tourism from Europe or from Canada or from other countries? Why do we
By the way, you
want?
know who gets hurt the most with Canadian tourism being frozen? State of Florida. This is a big, I've been waiting for some Florida. I mean, Canadian tourism to Florida is huge,
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah. I mean,
Big loss.
I'm from Boston originally, so I've heard a lot of the main stories with like
I've heard the
Old
main
Orchard
story
Beach
too. Yeah.
basically shut down. I've got friends that are, getting ready. I'm going to Boston to see the family for Easter. And this is also Boston Marathon weekend. I was
Okay.
stunned that not only were there like lots of hotels available, but the prices weren't crazy. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Oh, yeah, that's what's happening. People aren't coming.
Right.
They're not coming. And so this is, I mean, you think that this doesn't have an impact on the US at every level, whether it's the workers in these
Yeah.
businesses or it's the shareholders. I mean,
Uh,
all of these things, they have knock-on implications that are going to hurt us.
um, can you address something here? One of the things that I think is the biggest misnomer of NAFTA. It is true that NAFTA did real damage as far as the what happened to the industrial Midwest. Okay, they were hurt the most.
Yeah.
But you know who benefited the most in this country? It was the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt in general, the Sun Belt specifically. I go to Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee. We can talk about the state of Texas, state of Arizona. This was one of those cases where it's not. Donald Trump is so focused on trying to repair the damage in the northern states that everything he's doing is actually going to damage his some of his base red states economically in the South. Am I misreading this, or is this? I mean, you take the Mercedes and BMW factories that are all over the South. A lot of Japanese auto, that's not going to uh, that's not going to be a good thing with all these tariffs there. It's
Well,
not
the,
it's
the
not like those become
Mexicans,
American.
the Mexicans do understand the government. I mean,
Yeah.
Claudia Sheinbaum has, I think, her 86% approval ratings right now.
Hmm.
Her Morena party has done nothing but win since they've been founded. And that's a constitutional majority, so she can do whatever she
Hmm.
wants. And she wants to fix this with the Americans. And
Right.
that's why, I mean, they've been doing very little on fentanyl.
Hmm.
And now suddenly they're actually
Right.
engaged in all these raids. Why weren't they doing that over the last 5 years? Well, because no one was forcing them to. Far fewer people coming across the border illegally. A lot of that is the
Yeah.
Americans saying, we're going to send you to El Salvador. but some of it is the Mexicans actually tightening up on security and asking and getting more cooperation from the Americans, drone surveillance, overflight, all of this kind of thing. The Mexicans are now cracking down on transshipment from China through Mexico into the United States, which hasn't helped the Mexican economy very much, hasn't led to many jobs, has hurt their own small and medium enterprises on textiles, other low-end manufacture. So I think, Chuck, I agree with everything you're saying, but I'm not as worried about that because the Mexicans, unlike so many other countries in the world, have truly no other options but the United States. So on that front, I firmly expect that there will be a deal. And you've probably seen that even Howard Lutnick, who has been by far the least capable in presenting a coherent American economic perspective to the public, has been saying, actually, we think the Mexicans are doing a pretty good job here. They're pretty constructive. We're going to get something done. That is, I think, an accurate reflection of the conversations that are being had.
But I guess what I'm getting at here is that as he's trying to repair the industrial Midwestern economy, he's simultaneously hurting the Sun Belt and essentially coastal economies.
Yeah, but I mean, again, his intention is not to damage everything. His intention is, I'm the most powerful, so I'm just going to hit all these guys in the face, and they're all going to come back, and they're going to give me big, beautiful deals, and I'm going to look brilliant because Biden was so weak, and I'm the guy that stands up. And what he doesn't realize is that if you don't get those deals done the way you want them to, because you're fighting with too many people and you don't have that much power, and other countries do have leverage against you, and if they don't like you, they won't be as nice to you, even if it's against their interests, because they have domestic political constraints, like in Canada, like in Europe, other places. All of those things end up hurting all sorts of players inside the United States, including the Sun Belt, for example, in the U.S.
Look, we've gone nearly 40 minutes on these tariffs, and I'm going to do a bit of a speed round with you to get you out of here in under an hour.
Sure.
Just quickly, let's talk Iran and these direct talks. You seem pretty bullish that Trump's looking. There's some negotiations he does where he doesn't want to get to yes, and there are some negotiations where he does want to get to yes. You're pretty bullish that you think this is a negotiation.
Absolutely.
He wants to get to yes.
Yep.
And in fact, it will be a deal that Israel hates.
Yeah, certainly dislikes, maybe hates.
Will they try to undermine it the way they did undermine Barack Obama?
They're going to be more reluctant to try to undermine it. You saw the way that Trump acted with the Israeli prime minister in the Oval Office. I mean, it was a much politer affair than Zelensky in the Oval.
But he treated him like a subordinate. He treated him like a subordinate, no doubt about it.
And by the way, about fricking time, given how the Israeli PM runs ragged over American leaders. So I give Trump full marks on that, actually. I mean, look, if we're going to criticize him when he does something stupid, we should actually...
No, I mean, that's the frustrating thing with Trump, right? There is about 20 to 25% of his tactics that you're like, you know what, that is the tactic to use here. It's just 70% of his tactics are a mistake, but there are times.
I mean, I don't have an active working percentage in my head, but since you're asking me about Iran, yes. And Iran, he understands. He senses weakness. He knows that Iran is in a horrible position. He also was the one that was deciding, I'm going to go ahead with these attacks on the Houthis. You remember Vice President Vance was saying, don't do it in Singlegate. Now, a few weeks in, the Houthis are suing for peace. They're saying, look, if you just stop, we will stop hitting all of these ships that are going through.
Right.
Okay, where was that in the Biden administration, right? So, 100%. I mean, Iran is losing all of their proxies across the region. They certainly don't have the military capability to do any real damage to Israel. And so the Americans are saying, look, you better take a deal, and it's going to be a bigger deal than the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA under Obama, because otherwise we're going to give Israel all the military capability to really, really destroy you. And I see remember, the Supreme Leader came out a couple weeks ago and said, I don't even want to talk to Trump.
I know.
Now they're talking directly. So far, this looks pretty good.
And we know Trump's tight with all the Gulf state leaders, and they want him to cut a deal.
And they want him to, every one of them wants him to cut a deal.
So that feels right. Okay.
That feels right.
Turkey. Look, I'll be honest. I've been just, as a citizen, ashamed that the United States has basically turned the other way, watching what Erdogan has done to his political opponents and what he's doing there. Turkey.
If you were a European citizen, you'd feel the same way, Chuck.
Good. Well, that's I guess good to hear, but also frustrating. The
Depressing.
world's the world has really not been um they've not been that ashamed of this, and I don't know why that is the case, other than there's exhaustion out there when it comes to the pro-democracy movement. I get that. Um, but sounds like Erdogan is going to get away with it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It does sound that way. I mean, he's arrested the guy that was right before he was going to run for
Right.
president, the one guy that could actually beat him in an open democratic election, and he made it very
By the
clear
way,
he
is
has
it fair to
vested
call
interest.
Turkey? I always say this with Turkey. Turkey, the elections themselves are not rigged. It's just everything else is.
Yeah, I mean,
Is that
the
how you describe
media,
it?
the
Yeah.
judiciary, all the rest. I
Right.
mean, there's been some instances of ballot stuffing and the rest, but generally speaking, it's more about what you do to get to that point,
Right.
as opposed to the
It's
election
kind of what the
itself.
Iranians do.
But
They
the
decide who
Turks,
gets to run. Right.
that's right. But
Um,
and remember, the last election in Iran was actually a surprise. The president was
right.
a more of a moderate that was not expected.
Erdogan would not have won this election had the mayor been been
That's
his
right.
opponent,
He would
right?
have
I
lost.
mean, that's
He would have
crystal
lost.
clear.
That's
And
crystal
now
clear.
we assume he narrowly wins this. So my guess, look, when you try to suppress something like this, it doesn't always accrue to your benefit. I mean, there's got to be some risk he could lose here.
This is the China argument,
Right.
which I am increasingly taking the other side of, which is not
Mm-hmm.
good. So, I mean, there's a much broader question here about whether or not,
Mm-hmm.
given the nature of advanced technologies,
Right.
whether our present democratic systems are actually fit for purpose. And I want them to be, but I
Right.
fear they increasingly are not.
What should we expect out of South Korea with their political turmoil right now? And in some ways, is the global economic turmoil almost like a pretty good sobering moment for the South Korean electorate as they've got to be keeping their eye on the economic ball.
What happened to them a few months ago when their president declared martial law for like a few
Hmm.
hours, and it was shambolic, and it was born out of insecurity.
You know what it felt like? It felt like do you remember there was a spoof movie uh, way back when with Richard Dreyfuss pretending to be a dictator. It was called Pandora or something like that. Moon over Parador it was a made up country, but it was this sort of like somebody trying to play a strong man and just sort of
Yeah.
flopped. And it was more comic than sad. Yeah.
Yeah, well, keep in mind that he did not have a majority in their parliament. And so they were able to like bedevil and frustrate him
Hmm.
on every front. I mean, all sorts of investigations into his wife, into
Hmm.
his cabinet members, some of which were clearly trumped up.
Hmm.
They couldn't pass his budget. Now, I mean, nasty, dirty politics, but I mean, certainly no justification for martial
Right.
law, and he backed down, and now he's been
Right.
impeached, and he's going to end up in jail. And the next election will lead to the opposition party that controls parliament
Right.
also controlling the presidency, and that will be a much stronger South Korean government because you'll have both
Right.
houses, in a sense, but both checks and balances, if you will, rowing in the same direction.
Brazil and France are both trying to do to their polarizing leaders on the right what many in the United States tried to do to Donald Trump and
Yeah.
failed. And in many cases, it's a spectacular failure because when you when you go for the king, you best not miss, right? And in the United States, they missed, and we're now seeing, particularly with the grievance stuff and the targeting of all the different universities, everything we're seeing here. This is retribution is a real thing here. Um, what are the chances that whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil or Marie Le Pen in France, that these sentences stick and they get to move on, or this will we see a Trump effect in both countries?
So in Brazil, the judiciary is much more politicized.
Hmm.
They are willing to go after Bolsonaro for political reasons,
They
even
already
though
put
they're,
the previous president, who's the current president, in jail once, right?
yep,
So
yep. But I mean, look, the fact is that he was supporting insurrection to overturn a
right,
democratic election in Brazil. He will end up suspended, not allowed to run
right,
for president next time around. That probably means that he goes for his son,
right,
who, I mean, will be popular because
The
it's
martyr complex, we know that stuff works to a
yeah.
point.
But I mean,
Is it a majority? We don't know.
but it's not. Jair Bolsonaro is not going to be the next president. That's pretty
Right.
clear. And in France, this is this was a case that clearly there was illegality. The justices were not acting
Hmm.
politically. A strong majority of the French population believes that the charges should stick. The question will be whether or not during the period of her appeal, she will still be allowed to run. As of now, the answer is no, but that is going to be appealed up to the Constitutional
Right.
Court. If they decide she can run and she appeals through 2027, which could easily happen, she could run and maybe win. So that is where we're heading right now.
Let me close with what some folks may know you for best, which is when you do your annual list of risk assessments for the globe. Um, you had Trump up there pretty high as it was.
Oh yeah.
We're not even 100 days in. Would you redo your list, or would you keep it as
Well,
is?
the number one risk we put up was the G0 world wins. And
Hmm.
and the focus there was not on Trump specifically. The
Hmm.
focus was on the United States undoing its own global order and no other country or groups of countries capable of standing in and taking that leadership. And I think that that was number one and deserves to be number one.
Yeah.
And people underestimated just how much the old global order how was prepared to fragment.
Right.
They weren't
Look,
ready.
you named your company G0 for a reason, right? Or your
Yeah, no
media outlet.
G7, no
Yeah.
G20, and I certainly don't want it. I want it to
You
not
were
happen.
visioning. You, in many ways, you saw this coming years ago.
10 years ago, 12 years ago. So I think that needed to be number one. It's not like we had a G0 related risk for the last 5 years. This was
Right.
this year coming. But certainly if you
Yeah.
look at trade policy in the US, if you look at what we called rule of
Right.
dawn as opposed to rule of law, if you
Right.
look at the likelihood that US China was going to be in a much worse
Right.
place, yeah, and if anything, we should have been more alarmist than we were. Though again,
No.
at the time that we put it out, it was not priced in by the markets. It
No.
was not something that the
Trump
CEOs were
1.0
willing
turned
about.
out to be, I think the biggest mistake people make is viewing a Trump policy or decision through the prism of the first term.
Completely agree with you, Chuck.
You
Completely agree.
cannot do that right now.
Yep.
And you just cannot. Russia and Ukraine, is there a ceasefire this calendar year?
Uh, there might be. Uh, Trump wants one, and it's funny. This is the issue, Chuck, where Trump's advisors have been most different publicly from
Hmm.
Trump, right? Which
Yep.
is surprising with all of this
No,
loyalty.
Rubio's been critical of the Russians, and everybody's been like,
Kellogg's been out
it's
there.
obvious the Russians are the obstacle to peace, right?
Right.
What Donald Trump wants, it's the Russians that have said no. The Ukrainians have gotten to yes 7,000 times.
And Trump was
It's
willing to use the stick against Ukraine and effectively, like when he suspended intelligence and defense
yeah,
support, which he put back on, but when he did it, the Ukrainians were like, okay, we cannot mess with
uncle,
this.
right,
We will accept his ceasefire with no reservations,
right.
right? No conditions. But he hasn't been willing to personally do that to Russia. And he's going to have to if he wants to get a ceasefire. So let's see. I mean, I think that he has made a couple of comments, tentative
Right.
comments about losing patience, but then
Yeah.
he's backed away from them. So
No,
there's
he
something is
apologized. He seemed to
preventing him.
apologize on behalf of the Russians for a mistake over the
Yeah,
weekend.
I
And you're like, come
mean,
on, dude.
I found that, especially on the back of
Hmm.
Rubio and a number of Republican
Right.
senators and even Rick Grinnell. I mean, a bunch of people were
Yep.
all publicly saying this is not just tragic, this is unacceptable. We have to stop this,
Yeah.
except for the president. And Witkoff, the special envoy, has
Right.
been closer to Trump on this, particularly when you saw the Tucker
Well,
Carlson interview, which he
he
was
doesn't.
ill-advised to do.
I mean, this is where Witkoff's not his own man here. Witkoff, if he doesn't espouse what Trump wants, there'll be a different envoy.
I get it, but
Yeah.
he's been very effective despite that in his
Hmm.
engagements with the Gulf states and
Right.
Israel on the ground on a bunch of different topics that aren't
Well, I
easy to
think it's
do.
because they know he speaks for Trump. I mean, in fairness, like
Right.
in that case, he is the Secretary of State because Rubio doesn't always
That's
speak for
right.
Trump.
But I'm just
Witkoff
saying that he
does.
has not been
Right.
equally effective on Russia Ukraine, where I think he could have been more cautious in places. He's chosen not to
That's
do
fair.
that for reasons that are not completely clear to me.
All right. My clock says we made it just under an hour.
Okay, sounds
I
good to me.
cannot emphasize enough to folks, if you're at all interested in the geopolitical landscape, that G0 newsletter, Ian, I've blown smoke up your, you know what, before on this, but I just find it to be, it's better than, there are other quarterly, smart foreign policy places out there that do good newsletters. You do the best one.
Thank you, man. It's always great to see you. Really
Fantastic.
appreciate it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that tour of the globe. And there were a lot of things we didn't get to that we will get to again. I thought the most fascinating part of Ian's, I guess, prognostication is the likelihood that Donald Trump wants to cut a deal with the Iranians and how desperate the Iranians might be to cut a deal with Donald Trump. Not quite Nixon goes to China, but I do think if this does happen, and he could use any sort of positive PR. It'll be interesting. I wonder if it will get him positive PR or if it will divide the right on this. We'll see, and if it becomes an issue in Israel. Netanyahu sabotaged essentially Obama's ability to cut a deal with the Iranians. Would he do the same for Trump? Just something to think about. But with that, before I go, let's dabble into the Ask Chuck bin and take a look at our questions.
Ask Chuck.
See, I got to have the music. You're enjoying the music. Don't lie. You know you like this music. So here's the first question. And it comes from Nicole Mealy. And she writes, you mentioned a few books you assigned to your class. I'd love if you could share the physical lists. I didn't pay as much attention to history as I should have when I had someone guiding me throughout my education. As I'm getting older, I'm realizing the importance of history more and more, and I'd love to have some recommendations to better equip myself and gain a better knowledge of how we got here. Appreciate your time and knowledge. Well, let me give you a sense of, this is the book list I was referring to at McKay Coppins. Obviously, you enjoyed the Coppins interview, and I noted that Coppins' book on Mitt Romney was one that I'd assigned a class that I teach at USC. It's a terrific class called How Washington Works. That is my assignment for visiting students from USC who basically spend a semester in DC interning and getting a taste of Washington. And, you know, I'm there, and my class is designed to sort of teach them how Washington works at the moment, because Washington works differently with every administration. So I'll give you the book list that they got to choose from for their midterm as a way of at least understanding how today's Washington works. So I give them the choice of the following books. One called Madam Speaker, Susan Page's book on Nancy Pelosi. The second, The Price of Power, Michael Tackett's book and about Mitch McConnell. Both, by the way, Pelosi and McConnell essentially cooperated with both authors. So I do think I enjoyed both books. I think it gives you an understanding of at least how they executed power. And I think whatever you think of either Pelosi or McConnell, both of them were consequential and both of them were powerful congressional leaders that will take probably decades to replace. The next McConnell and the next Pelosi is probably not currently serving in the Senate and the House. Just something to think about. On how the two parties have changed. The two books that I sort of see as a companion on that, or what you are writing about there, which is the McKay Coppins book on Romney. Mitt Romney essentially kept a journal during his 2012 campaign, and it really does a good job. And then he kept this journal up throughout the Trump era while he was serving as a senator. And what Mitt Romney inadvertently does is help guide us from the changing Republican Party, what he saw on the campaign trail, what he realized the party was changing on him, and maybe his type of Republicanism wasn't really what the base wanted, and he was trying to figure out how to sell it and all those things. And I just think Coppins did a terrific job. I mean, yes, it's in Mitt Romney's voice essentially, but it really helps, I think, narrate, if you will, the change in the Republican Party from the Eisenhower-Romney run, essentially, that one wing of the party went on, to where the party is today with Trump, which in many ways, as I've told you before, is actually a throwback to the Republican Party pre-Eisenhower. And that evolution, I think this book captures it. And from stage left, Roy Teixeira has a great book called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? And in some ways, in the same way, Coppins helps the reader learn about how the party went from Romney to Trump and really went from becoming one thing to another. Roy Teixeira shows how the Democratic Party lost its working class voters, right? How it happened, and sort of it happened over a decade and a half. This isn't something that happens overnight. And I think Roy Teixeira does a good job of showing how it happened and showing perhaps where the party is headed and where it could sort of change where it's headed. And my guess is a lot of people who are thinking about running for president on the Democratic side have consumed this book. And that's why I think students ought to be consuming this book. And then to learn about how the influence game in Washington works. The Mullins brothers, my friend Brody Mullins and his brother, did a book called The Wolves of K Street. And it's actually, believe it or not, it's very gripping. They do a terrific job. There's some just amazing tales of lobbyists over the years and sort of the overconsumption, if you will, or over exuberance of some of them. But it gives you a good understanding of essentially how we got to this influence game of today. And that we are at the point now where it used to be the lobbying world was consumed with essentially citizen activists versus corporations. And now it's essentially corporations versus other corporations, right? They're all fighting over regulation that would hurt one business and help another. And somehow the citizens aren't even involved in this operation at all. But I do think, so those 5 books, and my students, I asked them to pick one and, write me an analysis and a review of it. But if you're looking for 5 reads that I think can help you understand today's Washington and today's politics in America, those are as good of a first 5 to read as you can get. So there you go. And no, I do not get a commission on any of the books if you buy them from Amazon, but perhaps I'm making a mistake. And maybe if all of these books suddenly become overnight bestsellers for a day, I'll know the power that we have already developed it here at the ToddCast with you, my incredible listeners. Ask Chuck. All right, my next question is from GW Joe in Nashville. I like this. My GW fellow alums are going to refer to themselves with Race High and with a little revolutionary love there. I appreciate it. And his question from GW Joe is this: is there an argument to be made that we are now a competitive authoritarian regime? Are we closer to Erdogan's Turkey than we are to our own democracy circa 1970, or pick any decade of your choice? I think it's worth a discussion. Congress has self-neutered itself. True. The executive is now ignoring laws. Fact. Flirting with ignoring courts. True. And is using its power to tip the scales against opponents like law firms that disagree with them. I also would factor in that I live in a place like Nashville, Tennessee, where my district has been gerrymandered and where I don't really have a say in my federal representation, limited congressional power, expansive executive action, and swaths of the country in non-competitive districts. Are we still a democracy? Well, look, we are, I still think we're the cleanest, sort of I guess one way to put it, one of my favorite expressions. And I learned this during the Great Recession when we were all worried about the state of our economy. And I had an economist friend use the following expression when he said, well, we're the cleanest pair of dirty underwear in the hamper, meaning you may think our economic system is kind of messy, kind of broken, what we were doing with the housing market, credit default swaps, all that business, except everywhere else is worse to keep your money, right? And that is frankly what Donald Trump is banking on with his tariff regime, which is that as bad as these tariffs are, as bad as unsettling as it all is, where else are you going to put your money? China? Rule of law? You really feel good about that? How about the EU? You think they're not going to want to tax your money? Where are you going to put your money? So that is something that he's counting on. As for I don't know if we're at Erdogan's Turkey. I'm not that down yet. Erdogan is using the power of government to pick his political opponent. We haven't gotten to that step yet. We're probably somewhere early stages Orban and Hungary, right? Where it is more about trying, because in this way, that's why Hungary's probably the better comparative for now, trying to, this sort of assault, using the power of government to influence private institutions like universities. That is a little more Orban-esque, and sort of, I think that's why we're not at Erdogan yet. Now, that said, I use Erdogan as an example a lot of where we could head, because Erdogan still, and you'll at this point, you've heard this in the interview with Ian, right? When I asked him this, which is, Erdogan, the elections themselves are not rigged in Turkey. It's just everything else is. So the media is rigged, the cultural institutions are rigged, the ability to who gets on the ballot is rigged, right? Iran is that way. Iran, the elections themselves aren't necessarily rigged, but who can get on the ballot, right, is rigged, right? So it is not a true democracy. Though once they decide who's up, they always claim to be a real democracy because they don't mess with their vote. And by the way, the guy who won this last time wasn't necessarily the first choice of the supreme leader. So there is, it's like, and it's, we'll see if Erdogan survives this. He's tried to stop this guy before, and he just lost elections in Istanbul, right? His party has tried to push back on it. So, but I do think your larger point that essentially the democracy's been weakened, and I think it's been weakened on the legislative level, right? I have all sorts of theories on this. I think we need to double the size of the House, and the House needs to get its power back, right? Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch, is about that. They're the power of the purse. They're the ones that decide how much authority a president has. They have the power right now to take this tariff emergency authority away from the president. We'll see if they do. I think that if we continue down this road, I don't think a Republican House will do this, but a Republican Senate with a Democratic House might. So I think that we could be, you got to hang in there for 2 years before Congress decides to use its authority. But I think we now know that the only time Congress wants to use its authority is when it's controlled by a party that is not in charge of the presidency. The real problem is what happens when Congress and the presidency are the same party. That's when we've seen all of these horrible decisions by Congress to hand authority over to the executive branch. They always do it when, quote unquote, their side is in charge and they're thinking, well, this is what they want in the moment. And then they regret it the second the other party wins. So, with this trade authority, the reason why this trade authority was ever handed over to the executive branch is because Congress thought the president would never be less of a free trader than Congress collectively, which before Donald Trump, that was true. That's obviously not true anymore. So, our elections are honest. There is certainly an attempt. I think, I go down. I just think that Trump believes in a more social. He believes in the same authorities that we have said socialist governments are trying to do. Right, socialist governments in general, particularly the ones in the global South, want to have a bit more. Want to use government authority not just over the economy but also over the culture, and over some other things. And I think in that sense, this is where I think Donald Trump is behaving more like a socialist, which is sort of ironic. The very thing that the Marco Rubios of the world have fought their whole life against. But Donald Trump doesn't believe in limited government. He really does believe in the strong arm of government. Look at how much he's using it. So, and I guess I would argue until I'd like to see a debate framed that way and see how the public reacts and see how this goes. So I think that there is, we are not yet at Erdogan or Hungary today. But if you look at the early stages of what Orban did, you can see some of the similarities. And obviously, I'm not saying this stuff can't slip away. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm surprised that there isn't more outcry of the lack of due process for the person that was mistakenly deported, the resident of Maryland who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador. But then again, this in some ways, I think we're finding out that what truly will turn Americans off of this style of governing by Donald Trump is when it impacts their pocketbook. And so while due process and some of these things people do care about when they think it's being taken away from them, in many ways, this has been true of the American voter for decades. They don't always worry about it for somebody else. They worry about that stuff when it happens to them. That's why the economic standing here. I mean, I have a friend of mine who's really nervous, sort of reminds me of where you are about the democracy, thinks that I'm being a little too Pollyannish. And he's suddenly feeling good because he thinks, hey, if there's economic calamity, it means the voters are going to turn on Trumpism, which means we're not going to have to worry about this anti-democratic streak that we've seen rise up on the right. We'll see who's right on this one. Let's see how the midterms go. Let me put it in another way. If Donald Trump is able to use the power of the Justice Department or the FBI to essentially disqualify a potential Democratic candidate for president, then we can have a discussion about whether we're on the road to Turkey, because that's what Erdogan has done. And I'm not going to sit here and say that that could never happen here. And obviously, this president has decided to get very, very close to the Justice Department in ways that I think, for all the criticism he said of what Biden did, he claims Biden politicized the Justice Department. He is then doing what Biden did times 1,000. And as I always was brought up with, do two wrongs make a right? This has been the biggest problem in American politics, is that too many people are using power when they get it now to essentially execute a wrong and rationalize it because they think the other side did the wrong first. That arguably is why we're in the position we're in right now in our political system. All right, on that uplifting note, I'm going to leave the questions there for now. Don't worry, keep them coming. There are a lot I would have done, but this week I got some great interviews, so I'm not going to have a full just Ask Chuck type of upload. I will do that again next week, but I got a really special treat for you after this episode. Our next episode, it's a special treat, especially for those of you that love a good conspiracy theory. That's my tease for now. And with that, until we upload again.